Hello, welcome to my channel, Bobo Bun So Vintage Life. I'm Lisa, a vintage inspired seamstress and dressmaking teacher. I love to share everything that inspires me and what I'm making and ideas with you here. So welcome. If you're new to my channel, then a big hello, and a big hello to the lovely new subscribers I've had recently. It's lovely to have you all here. In today's video, I am going to be doing in two parts. I did film it before and I had problems and my camera deleted it. I think I mentioned it in my last video. So I've decided I'm going to do it in two parts. I want to look at vintage patterns using the vintage originals, vintage reproduction patterns and vintage inspired patterns. They're all my go-tos and I thought you might find it interesting to have a little look at those. So I'm going to look just at vintage originals in this first video, and then I will post next week or the week after the second part, but probably next week because it makes sense, doesn't it, to all follow one after the other. And that will be looking at vintage reproduction patterns and vintage inspired patterns. And there's so many places that you can get all these things from. So I am going to talk you through all that in a moment. I shall see you shortly. So first off, looking at the vintage patterns, I thought I'd just give you a little potted history of how they all came about. I'm no great expert, this has all been researched and yeah, there might be gaps that need filling in, but I'm just trying to give you an overview. So from the mid 1800s we had the home sewing machine, so obviously that opened up the world of sewing and recreating at home for the home sewists. The sewing patterns have been there as templates. I mean they go back, you know, very early. I think even the 15th century we see some templates, but not for the home sewists, but they were there, and there were some pamphlets in the 18th, 19th century that people could use, but obviously from the 19th century they start improving, you know, with the advent of the sewing machine. So it's very much like our world today, isn't it? People would see what other people were wearing, or they might see, you know, illustrations in the newspaper. Obviously they didn't have as much access like we do with film and etc. as the pattern industry sort of moves on. But you know, you were still inspired by what other people were wearing or what you saw in the shops, but you couldn't necessarily afford it. So people wanted to recreate their own and create it, say, with their own twist, or, you know, literally out of need. I mean, that's what comes through when you go later on in history to the feed sack fabrics. This is moving away from patterns, but the feed sack fabrics absolutely fascinate me. How, you know, they were, the feed sack before it was printed was what you got your vegetables, your flour, etc. in, and during the Depression they realised that women were using that fabric to sew with, so they started printing on it, and women would then repurpose those sacks into being clothes themselves or quilts or whatever. So yeah, I think it's fascinating how all these things evolve. And excuse me if I move my head funny, terrible snoring man who was hogging the whole bed last night and I couldn't wake him up, so I went on the sofa because the other bedrooms are taken at the moment and I've crooked my neck, so I can't really move that way. So if you see me moving funnily, that's why. Just to say, I can't really put my head back on. God, it's so painful. Right, so back to the patterns. So the earliest people to bring out the patterns were William and Ellen de Morest, and that was in 1860. They began the home pattern sewing industry, and these were unprinted. They were cut to size. They're often cardboard templates. People could either sort of rent time, you know, by cutting them out, and they were usually just to one size. You know, you wouldn't have an individual one to one size, another individual one to another, etc. These were just one size only, so you needed a lot of skill to know how to alter and adapt these patterns. But who's being fussy? This is the start of the whole industry, so whoa, you know, it's exciting. They also published a magazine. I mean, in the end it had thousands of subscribers. There was about 300 shops that stocked their magazine as well. William was like the mastermind behind the business, and Ellen was the one that would look at fashions, what was happening in Europe as well as America, and the fashion magazines, etc. And so she would start adding one of their sewing patterns, and it would be you know, stapled in to their magazine along with some fitting and sewing tips. So it's the precursor of what we know as the early sewing magazine, or the sewing patterns that we're used to today, you know. So they started that. They were just amazing. And then, sorry, I hear someone at the door. God, I hate moving like this. But unfortunately, William never patented the patterns, so they were free for anybody to take on, which Ebenezer Butterick, major competitor of Butterick, and we've got James McCall, who's a Scottish tailor. He's starting to come up and be a competitor of theirs. Demores, they sold in 1887, so they went out of the industry, even though they were the ones that set it up. They got it all going. So we're now moving on to other competitors, of which there are loads. I'm not going to talk about all the vintage pattern companies there once were. I'm just looking at, you know, just a handful here. So we've got Butterick, who launched in 1863. He's painted in the patterns in 1880. And the difference was he offered them in various sizes, standard graded sizes. But, you know, you just buy one pattern of each size, but there were a choice of sizes. And they were on unprinted tissue paper, you know, with lots of little holes. So if you've seen any vintage patterns, you'll be familiar with that. I'll be showing you some in a moment, and I'll be popping in some little videos to explain through what they are. So as the range developed, by the 1900s there was an envelope, and you had the pattern with an image on the front. And then by the 1910s, sort of moving forward, there was an instructions sheet included. So it really started to evolve. And by 1948, they bought some really good printing presses, which meant they could actually print the seam allowance, the pattern marking instructions, etc., rather than just being plain with these pre-cut holes and notches. So it really, really took off. And then we've got the other competitor, I said, McCall's. Now, McCall's, they started printing on their tissue paper very early on. But the difference with McCall's is they were one of the few pattern companies to do this consistently, that they would print the date of release of that pattern on the pattern envelope. So it really helps us nowadays that we can date those. So, you know, if you're a collector of McCall's patterns, you will know which year that pattern came from. So that differentiates them there. And the range of patterns that I've actually got, I think I've got sort of Butterick. I'm just looking at them all here. I've got Butterick Simplicity, some Weldons Style, I've got a few others. There would do Barry. There were so many different pattern companies. The other one I want to look at is Burda, because in my next video I'll be talking about the Burda magazine. So Burda were a German publishing company. They set up in 1949. They introduced the fashion magazine, which was focusing on sewing. Well, I'm saying 1949 was a fashion sewing magazine, sorry, not the company was established. And they were focusing on sewing to make high fashion more accessible to everybody, you know, to the home sewist. And then it slowly evolved into what we know as Burda style. It was called Burda Modern when it was first brought out. And then 2 years later they included patterns, which are just like looking at a map. They're really busy, the Burda patterns in the magazine. But the magazine has loads of inspiration and whatever. So they would then eventually move into having their own pattern company. But that's how they started out, solely from a magazine, very much like the Demorists. So I hope you found that interesting, just the background. And then next I'm going to look at some of the vintage patterns, vintage magazines and vintage sewing books. There's a wealth of excitement in all of this. I'm going to start off by looking at the patterns, and I think it makes sense to talk about the one that's on my mannequin Foxy Lady at the moment, this beautiful one. This is in modern fabric. I am going to make it again, and it's from this pattern that I found through an Instagram seller, but her shop's on Etsy, so I'll pop the link up for her, you know, and put it down below. But it's this Weldons pattern. I mean, interestingly, this one is wrapped like this as a sheet that was wrapped around the tissue, and then instructions inside. So you don't get a lot. You've got the lay plans here. It's quite interesting. Rather than being an envelope, it was put together like this. But I absolutely loved it. Was the bow. Can you see that? The bow on the front, how it cinches the waist in, that absolutely drew me to this pattern. And it's on plain tissue paper, so I'll show you that in a moment. And I knew it was my size. It's a bust 38. Now in the vintage patterns they're slightly smaller, so the 38 bust, I knew that I could then slightly grade it down for my high bust measurement, so that one works. And the hip size, even though the hip size is free on these full skirts, I knew the waist, the bust, the hips, everything fitted me, so that's perfect. So normally I have to grade up a vintage pattern, because until I think it was about the 70s, we've still got them all coming just in one size. So when you're buying vintage patterns, whether you get them from eBay, Etsy, charity shops, somebody passes them on to you, or you get them from the magazines, they will all come just in one size. So I, as a rule, I always try and get my high bust measurement, because that's the size I fit on. Because if we go by modern ready to wear, I'm a size 12 up here, but a 16 on my boobs and a 14 at my waist. So I have to do a lot of grading between full bust adjustment, but the most important one is getting the sizing right here on your high bust, if you've got a difference of more than 2 inches between your high bust measurement and your full bust. So I always make sure that I've got a vintage pattern that will either be my size for my high bust, or it will be a size 1 up or 1 down, because it involves a lot less faffing around with the pattern. So that's the rule I go by. Sometimes I buy them just because I love the artwork and it will inspire me for other makes, but if I want to use the pattern, that's what I go for. You also need to check that you've got all the pieces in your pattern. If there aren't facings, I mean, they're easy enough to make. I say easy, I mean, I know they're really easy for me, but you might think, oh, but they really aren't a tricksy thing to make at all. So that's what I do with the sizing for these. What else have I got to tell you about this? Yeah, if you look at this pattern, it's got a cut V on it, and you'll see mine, I've pinned it down because I've decided I'm going to take that facing off. I'm going to make it into a V-neck, and I'm also going to make these grown-on sleeves come in a bit neater, because it makes me feel a bit frumpy. It feels a bit, you know, sort of dowager, you know. I think the nearest I'd think of was, who was she in Importance of Being Earnest, with the handbag? Sorry, I can't remember. Lady Bracknell, that's it, that's come to me. I always feel a bit, you know, that Edwardian sort of full bosom look. If there's too much fabric going on there, I just don't like it with my full bust. So that's that. But with this pattern, what I did was I've traced it off. You can see it in here on interfacing. I traced it off so it would be nice and sturdy, and I could put all the pattern markings on it. So I definitely know I'll be making another one of those. Other dresses that I've made recently, this one only came with the front bodice and it was a bit too small, so I've graded it up and I used the back bodice from another. So I'll pop a picture up of what I made with this, and I've got another dress at the moment cut out that I'm using this bodice. So absolutely love that. It's just absolutely gorgeous. I love it even with the boat neck and the thing, but I wanted this high square neck, so that's what I used that for. This has been quite a popular little pattern to use. And this one, as you can see, has got printing on, and it's even got the seam allowances printed on. So that one there is quite a handy one. But this one I've used as this little shell top with the bow, and I had to alter the pattern, move the bust darts down as is usual to me. So I've traced it off. I never ever want to mess up the original. They're your masters, and especially with the vintage. You screw these up, unless you're lucky enough to find another one, you really are jinxed. There's other words I could have said, but I chose jinxed. So yeah, always trace them if you're doing any alterations, so that you haven't messed that up. I love this little shell top. I've made this a few times, so I think which ones I made it in a bark cloth or a white broidery on glaze, and can't remember for the life of me what the other one is in, but I will find the images and I will show those to you. I've got this beautiful dress that I intend to make one day soon. Absolutely adore this. This is a 1950s. I love that false button placket, and I love a high midriff. It just really excites me. Got a couple of gorgeous blouses from the 50s. They are delightful. So they're both butterick actually. I love this little Peter Pan collar one here, which is absolutely gorgeous. Another one in my plans to make, I want to make a waistcoat. I was going to do it this winter, but I didn't get around to it. Don't know if you can see that lovely lady there in her waistcoat and fitted pencil skirt. So that's a style pattern. And I've also got this one here, this absolutely gorgeous blackmore pattern. And I don't really like halter necks too much on me. They don't suit me so much, but it was the skirt I was drawn to and the jacket with this one. So might use that to make a nifty little suit at some point. So. Now in my other patterns, I've got a pattern that links to a book. A friend of mine, while we were in lockdown, it was through something sad, but it was very exciting for me. An aunt of hers died, and she was clearing out the house and found an amazing amount of fabric and knitting patterns and threads and these sewing books and a beautiful 1950s cream sewing machine, and asked if I would like them, to which I was obviously yes. And you know, vintage shopping was off the cards during lockdown, so we met in a car park and I was going treasure troving, and it was so exciting, and I did some baking and we had a picnic out there in the car park in the freezing cold, and had a little walk around. And when I got home, I think I was just shaking with delight at everything I'd been given, and she was just chuffed because it all went to someone who would appreciate it. So one of the books in there was from this Pins and Needle treasure book. Now this was a magazine during the 50s, might have started about in the 40s even. It was called Pins and Needles. Now this book covers everything, you know, from knitting, crochet, homemaking, sewing, how to tat. That word how to tat always annoys me. My ex always used to say, "You tatting again," but it was in a disparaging way, so the word tatting really irritates me. Anyway, that's a negative, we're not going to include those. Anyway, coming back to this, so I was looking through this, it's referring to patterns that then you can buy from them, which obviously I can't. I need to go back in time so I can order them. I love so many of these. This is if you're large at the top, how generally kind that is. And it was this dress, this jumper dress, and the blouse under that I'd mentioned in one of my Instagram posts. Absolutely loved it. And this lovely lady on Instagram, Jane in Ireland, she said she'd got just the one, could she have my address? And she sent it to me. I mean, it's just beyond kind. I've still not made it up. I really must at some point. So it came in this envelope. So this would have been someone who subscribed probably through a magazine, because it says the Pattern Bureau Fashion Service and it's New York. And so she obviously, was it Mrs. Tom Lazier? So she got this sent to her from New York, the pattern that she'd ordered. And the patterns, they always come cut of this period. You know, you haven't got to cut them out, which is interesting. We have them on the full tissue and we have to cut them out. But they're cut to that one size, so that works, done for us. And they have the seam allowances included. Not all patterns do, so you have to check that on the note. But it was this pattern which has got the blouse as well. It was pretty darn it. I must go back to this page. I've just folded my book up. I'll show you. I think side by side, can you see them there? They're a pretty darn good match. So that was the pattern. The sizing is all mine, which is absolutely incredible. I've got plain tissue pieces, of which there's quite a few. This is a very, very fragile instruction guide, so I'm going to open that out in a bit to show you in another film, so I can talk about it. And with this pattern, it's just one sheet with the illustration on the front, which are absolutely beautiful. And it's all folded on one piece of paper with the sizes and the lay plans. And it's quite brief, you know, the instructions, so you need to know what you're doing, but absolutely beautiful. Lovely little bit of history. Then they're plain tissue pieces, and these long dots along the front, they denote the grain line. So where you see those, that's where your grain line is. And then looking at another piece, this is on the front facing, and those 3 dots there, they're showing you where you will then make the slit in the front for the cut. So it's like the stitching lines, and you've got the numbers perforated on the pattern pieces. And then those dots on the side, they show it's to be placed on a fold, and it's even got gather printed at the top there for you. Handily, my gin and tonic has been given to me. Now, looking at the jumper dress, it's quite a fragile pattern. I love the drawings of that, and it's really quite a good match for the one in my book. So I'll carefully unfold this to show you. We've got the pattern pieces and the illustrations and the lay plan on the front. Just really, really gently opening this up. I really must mend it, mustn't I? So naughty of me. When you're turning it over, there's so many instructions that are useful on this. It tells you how to do the pockets, tailored pockets, and then to do bound buttonholes, and also how to do the side snap closure. Also in the treasure trove haul from my lovely friend was this book. It's called Complete Dressmaking in Pictures, which is an absolutely marvellous book. It's got some black and white photos of some patterns that you can draft yourself, but all the way through, I love this illustration at the beginning, all the way through it will tell you how to do various things, whether it's sewing cuffs, how to sew welt buttons, bound buttonholes. The illustrations are lovely. I'm trying to find some of the coloured ones. There you go. To do flat facings. I love how it's set out. It's quite childlike, like the children's annuals. And then at the back, get past the children, we've got pattern blocks for how to make various things. Whether there be a dress, a blouse, cami knickers. There's a cosy house coat here, and there is a photo later on of them wearing that lovely cosy house coat, so it looks more like a dress. There we go, and that's the cosy house coat. So for the home sewers that knew how to draft her patterns, this book would be the go-to. The lady I teach in California, she was so impressed with this book that as we were having our session, she went straight on to I think it was eBay and found it, and she was so excited when it came. There was like one available and she bought it. If you do manage to find a copy of this book, then I suggest get it, because it's a wealth of information. I was just incredibly lucky to get this 1950s book given to me. Now, I'm always collecting vintage sewing books whenever I can, and you know, very excited when I find another one to put in the collection. This one, I couldn't believe, I found it for £6 and it goes for a lot more. It's the Pictorial Guide to Home Dressmaking, and I know a few people got it. It's just the most amazing book. Again, it has absolutely everything that you could hope for in here, and the illustrations alone, they're just so beautiful. This one was printed in 1940, so it's right at the start of the war, you know, early on. And so there's obviously a lot of how to repurpose clothes and whatever, and how to make corsages, but it works off a lot of the pattern blocks. So there's a pattern in here for a blouse, and on the other side it shows you how to adapt a block to turn it into the blouse. But it's just amazing. But I absolutely love going through that book. And that blouse I show is very similar to the one I'm wearing today, which I'll be talking about in my next video. And the overalls I'm wearing, these are from vintage reproduction patterns, so from Wearing History, the home front overalls and the smooth sailing blouse. So yeah, I'm in my 40s clothes, so I want to feel cosy. Yeah, my all-in-one with no drafts around my back. I love wearing this, so that's what I'm wearing today, and I will be talking about those patterns in my next video. Now, as I said, when you've got these patterns, that was me clicking a folder open, when you've got these patterns, if they're not your size, you need to know how to alter them and grade them. There's this fabulous guide here. It's pattern grading, part 1. And I got this from Mrs. Depew, so if you look for Mrs. Depew online, there's absolutely tons of things in here, in the index. And I'll give you just a couple of pages to give you an idea of the alteration she shows you how to do to alter the pattern. So there's a lot of information to digest in there, but that's a really good start for grading the vintage patterns. If you actually want to design and draft your own blocks, so moving into pattern cutting, sorry, ooh, stupid. This book by Winifred Aldrich. Now I think this one's a 1980s reprint. You get various, no, this is, yeah, 1984, the one I've got. This was gifted to me again by a lovely Instagrammer. There's so many kind people out there. I've still got the note somewhere. I think I've dropped it out the back here. So many kind people that get in touch, and if they don't want the thing, ask if I'd like it. So it's just amazing. So this book is just absolutely brilliant for drafting your own patterns. So you could look at your vintage pattern that you've got, know it's not your size, but work out how to draft your own. So that's another good idea. Now this book's from the 80s, so it's not like pure vintage, but I got this yesterday in a charity shop because it's got a wealth of information for sewing. So I always pick these up because there'll probably be some other tips that I've not come across, and just always expands my knowledge. So that's with the books. And then lastly, go over to the magazines, and the magazines were where all of this home sewing started, wasn't it? So I've got a few here that are French magazines. This one's in a, sorry, state, poor thing. Is it Femme d'Aujourd'hui? Pronunciation. My French pronunciation isn't great, my apologies. So it's an amazing, amazing magazine, that one, with some beautiful colour plates here. So I'll show you through some more of that. Echo de la Mode is another one. So they're 1950s, and then I've got 1940s. What's this one? 1949 and a 1950. So I'll show you those in the next film. And then I've got a few editions of Stitchcraft, which I love. Got some other magazines as well, but this was the ladies' home one. This is 1957. Excuse me. Just love the pictures. It's mainly knitting and home crafting as opposed to sewing, even though they will advertise sewing machines and thread that you can get. Just trying to find at the back if there's anything. Oh, there's an advert for Tampax here. Never realised it went as early as 1957. You were probably supposed to be a married lady if you used Tampax, I imagine. She's got a bow tied around the end of her finger. Use your imagination on that one. And we've got facing ribbon adverts. I mean, I love them for all the patterns and the ideas, but also the advertising. It just really excites me. Here's your knitting machine you can get. Thought you might like to see inside my vintage magazines. This is 1949. They're just stunning in illustrations and great inspiration for things that you might want to make, and similar patterns, as we can't obviously access these originals now. This is all the beautiful Christmas wear. The next one is a 1950s magazine, and they remind me of the same paper that my Bunty comic came on, you know, and it's like the grown-up illustration version. I mean, those shirts, aren't they just so beautiful? Just really elegant. Then we've got 1950 colour, you know, front magazine, but the similar pictures inside. They're all printed. The aprons. I love the styling of these, let alone you know, the imagery. I've got quite a few blouse patterns similar to this. It's just beautiful seeing the originals and all those gorgeous colours for the dresses. For this one, I'm just flicking through, just showing you the type of things. We've got toys, adverts, and there's knitting patterns and articles. And there's just a few, you know, fashion plates in there. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope you found that interesting, as I have, and sharing some of my collection with you. I wonder if you collect too. It's not necessarily just for using them. I've got people who come to my sewing who've never sewn, they collect fabric because they love looking at it and stroking it. Sometimes we just enjoy the beauty of these things. So in my next video I will be looking at vintage reproduction patterns and vintage inspired. Today was all about the vintage originals. So thank you very much. If you want to subscribe, please hit the bell and join me for my next video. It'd be lovely to have you along another time. So happy sewing everybody, and I shall see you very soon. Goodbye.